Okay, good. Then I'd like to say good morning. My name is Helen Kirschbaum. I'm here this morning from the Goodwin Holocaust Museum and Education Center, and we're very proud to be partnering with Sterling High School, the New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education, and Magpie. And I'd like to remind you that Magpie is recording today's program. With me this morning are 3 World War II veterans who we'd like to thank for joining us today in commemoration of Memorial Day. To my right is Mr. Ernest Gausman, Mr. Tony Marone, and to my left is Mr. Arthur Seltzer, and they will all be taking the opportunity to speak to you in just one moment. But I'd first like to have all the schools introduce yourselves, tell us who's in the classroom with you, and where your school is located. So Centerville, would you like to start us off?
We're 8th grade students from Centerville Middle School and Hempfield School District, and we're here because we studied the diary of Anne Frank and various aspects of discrimination related to the Holocaust.
And where is Centerville located?
Pennsylvania, Lancaster.
Near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Well, thank you for joining us. Egg Harbor Township, can you introduce yourselves, please?
Sure. Egg Harbor Township High School, about 9.5 miles outside of beautiful Atlantic City. We're here with U.S. History 2 and Holocaust classes. Nice to see you guys.
Nice to see you too. Thanks for joining us. Penwood Middle School, can you introduce yourselves, please?
Yes, hi. We are Penwood Middle School in Yardley, Pennsylvania, which is northeast of Philadelphia, Bucks County. We are an 8th grade class who has just finished reading the diary of Anne Frank.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And Londonderry High School, if you could introduce yourself, please.
We're the Londonderry High School from New Hampshire. Louder? We are the Honors English students, and we've been doing a Holocaust unit.
Say where we're located.
What?
Where you're located.
New Hampshire. Londonderry.
They don't know where that is.
Okay, did I hear you say you're located in New Hampshire?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for joining us. Sterling High School. We're actually broadcasting from Sterling, so I'd like them to introduce themselves also.
We're Sterling High School from Somerdale, New Jersey, and we're U.S. History 1 and 2 classes.
Okay, thank you very much. You can see that we have a very mixed group here today, but I hope that everyone can get some really important lessons out of today's presentations. 2 of the gentlemen with us are actually concentration camp liberators, and I'm going to ask Mr. Seltzer to speak to you first, tell you a little bit about himself as well as what he saw during World War II. Even though their experiences are all different, they are all eyewitnesses to history. And I hope that you realize that you are obviously the last generation that's going to have the opportunity to hear from World War II veterans. Sadly, there are over 1,000 World War II veterans dying each day across the United States. And so there are fewer and fewer who are going to be able in the future to share this history with us. So Mr. Seltzer, why don't you start us off?
Again, my name is Arthur Seltzer, and I'm a past department commander of the Jewish War Veterans, which is the oldest veteran organization in the United States. Again, I was drafted into the Army in 1943 after finishing 1 year at the University of Pittsburgh. Took my basic training with the 99th Infantry Division in Camp Van Dorn, Mississippi. Went overseas in March of 44 and was in England. And in England there's an island called the Island of Wight, and we were sending messages hoping that the Germans would pick up these messages that the invasion was not going to be Omaha Beach, but was going to be Calais, France, which is further up the coast. Again, I landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day in the second wave, and again, as much as we hoped they would not move most of the troops up there, but it didn't happen. Again, after getting off the beach, we got off the beach about 5 o'clock that day because it was pretty rough. From there we met. Our first combat again was St. Lo. St. Lo is in France, and the town was leveled to the ground, and also it was the first time that our own planes had dropped bombs by accident on some of the men from the 30th Infantry Division that killed about 36 soldiers. After that, we went up and we were in the Battle of Bulge, which took place at, we were in the Ardennes forest. They're showing a dollar bill right now. Before we went over the side of the ship into our landing crafts, the gentleman in charge of the landing craft that I was in, there's 36 of us, asked if I would like to sign a dollar bill. I was attached to the 29th Infantry for communication purposes only. The unit that I served with was the 4th Armored Signal Battalion, which were all specialists. That dollar bill has 36 names on it, and at the end of the day, in our landing craft, there was only 2 of that survived. The gentleman who asked me to sign the dollar bill plus myself. As I said before, we then, after St. Lo, we came to the Battle of the Bulge, and the Battle of the Bulge, we were in the Ardennes forest, and the 101st Airborne was surrounded, and you may remember in some of the movies in Band of Brothers, they asked the commander of the 101st Airborne to sign a surrender paper, and he sent it back with the words nuts. And again, he did not surrender because we were able to come and help him out. After that, I came to Munich, Germany, and Munich, Germany is roughly about 9.5 miles from Dachau concentration camp. And Dachau concentration camp was the camp that we liberated. Right now they're showing some pictures of the D-Day landing on Omaha Beach, which was June the 6th. Many people are not aware, but the original D-Day was supposed to be June the 5th, but because of weather conditions, they had to postpone it for another day, and they finally decided to go on June the 6th. You now see a map up there that shows exactly where Munich, Germany is, and again, as I said, Dachau is, the town of Dachau is about roughly 6 miles or 6.5 miles northwest of Munich. Again, this is a picture of the Battle of the Bulge, and which I spoke about. This is the gate to Dachau concentration camp. And these, I was with the 4th Armored Division at that time, and these are 2 of the soldiers from the 40th Armored that had to keep the people, the inmates in the camp, because we were bringing up medical supplies and all to see if we could take care of them, because they were nothing but skin and bones. Again, this is a picture of the clothing and some of the pictures that I took at that day at Dachau concentration camp. And again, as I said before, it was a sight that I will never forget. These are some of the inmates that were lined up along the fence before I left to take pictures of them so that I would have it. Also, the one completely to the right in the stripe of pajamas, he lives in Ohio, and I was able to make contact with him after the war was over, and I spoke to him. And again, he had come to the United States and married a lady who was also in a concentration camp, It was not the same one that he was in, but he definitely was a liberator and liberated, and I was glad to speak to him. Again, the day before we arrived at Dachau, a carload of about 20 cars arrived at Dachau, and it was loaded with more camp. They were either survivors from camps being transferred to Dachau or were coming directly from their homes. When they came directly from their homes, they had their own clothes, and when they got to the camp, naturally, they were stripped of their clothes and given those striped pajamas. These, again, are some of the pictures that we took as we were going around the camp. And some of those people that were on that train load, some of them were still alive, and most of them were dead at the time of arrival. This is the way they would bury the dead. They would cut a trough out, as you can see on your right there. They would then take a bulldozer and take the dead bodies and push them into the trough. They then would cover them with lime and then cover them with the dirt. That's the way they buried the ones that they had killed. Now, when we arrived, to the left, they were the ashes that were taken out of the crematories that were still hot. And Hitler had notified the commander of Dachau to kill as many as possible. And again, when we did finally get there, we were able to save quite a few of them. Again, this is a list of the camps that were liberated by United States soldiers. Down in the left and second from the bottom, you'll see the 40th Armored Division liberated Dachau on April 29, 1945. So again, it was something that I can't forget, and I speak about it because it's necessary for people to definitely know what took place during that war. And you will hear very shortly from two other people who were there. So again, I thank you and be looking forward to hearing when you're asked to speak or ask questions, and I hope I was able to give you some idea of what took place. This is a picture of my, well, we lost it, but I returned again to retrace my steps with my wife, and the camp was completely different than when I was there the first time. All the barracks had been removed. They kept roughly about 6 or 7 barracks, and they made a museum out of the barrack, those barracks there. This is a picture that was taken of me when I spoke in another group over in Philadelphia at another school. So again, I want to thank you for listening to me, and hope that you'll have some good questions to ask. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Seltzer. And I think we're going to ask that you hold all questions until after each of the speakers has finished speaking, and then we will take questions from all the schools for any of the speakers who you hear this morning. So if you happen to have paper in front of you, feel free to write down anything that you need to remember to ask Mr. Seltzer. Next, I'm going to ask Mr. Gausman to speak to you. His story is different than Mr. Seltzer's because he did not liberate a concentration camp, but he too was in the United States Army during World War II and is going to share his experiences with you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ernest Gausman. I grew up in a small town in Western Germany where my family had been living for more than 300 years. As a matter of fact, during World War I, my father was a master sergeant in the German army fighting the Americans. He ended up the war being decorated with the Iron Cross, and in spite of all this, in 1942 he was murdered, as were a lot of members of my family. I grew up in very comfortable circumstances until 1933 when Hitler came to power. After that, things changed drastically. I went to a gymnasium hoping to someday become a veterinarian. And in 1935, I'm skipping a lot of time here because we're time constrained. In 1935, I was told that no Jews are permitted to continue schooling in institutes of higher learning anymore, and I was kicked out of school at age 15. That is for 1935, so it'll tell you how old I am and why we are telling our story still today and as long as we're able to. Anyhow, I got out of school, and then the question was, well, what do you do? Well, my father's suggestion was, since eventually there is no life for you in Germany, it might be good to learn a trade with which you can make a living even if you don't speak the language in another country. I did mechanical work, and had training for about 2 years or so with a Jewish company that was still in business. They were Aryanized, quote unquote, which means all the Jews were dismissed, as was I. And then I went home, and I was lucky enough to be able to find a family friend, a Christian family friend, not far away from where I lived, but where nobody knew I was Jewish, where I was able to continue my mechanical training. This was all good and well until on the 10th of November 1938, I got a frantic phone call from my sister. Go home immediately, all the synagogues are burning. Well, I got on my bike about 15 miles away from home, and the minute I got home, our local policeman, we had a one-man police force in town, he showed up and he said he had orders from higher up to arrest every Jewish male between the ages of 16 and 65, quote unquote, to save them from the enraged German populace because a German consular official had been killed in Paris by a young Polish Jew. That was a pretense. To make a long story short, our policeman, who was a good friend of ours and a neighbor, in fact his oldest son and I were schoolmates, he said to my father, look, I know you're not 65 years old yet, and I just forget that you're here, but Ernest, you got to go along. I went with him, ended up in the local jail where I spent about 2 days, and then a bus came that picked me up, took me to the district capital, and there we were joined with a number of other people that had also been arrested, ended up at Gestapo headquarters at Aachen, which was the district capital. A train was waiting for us, and we were herded into it, always guarded by armed either stormtroopers or SS men who wore black uniforms, and into a train, and off it took. We had no idea where we were going to go until we found out we were basically at the railroad station at Weimar, which is very close to Buchenwald concentration camp. Chased off the train by SS guards who used their rifle butts to hurry everybody along, and don't forget, there are a lot of these people were 65 years old, a lot of them even older, even though the orders were to arrest only those up to 65. And buses or trucks took us to the camp. Our hairs were shaved, and after that we were marched into barracks that, well, you've seen pictures of concentration camps, how the barracks were arranged. They were open on one end and shelves about 3 feet apart, and there we spent whatever time we were forced to spend in concentration camp. Fortunately, we were all people of the so-called Crystal Night action. I imagine you've heard of Crystal Night. That was when this German official was killed, and they arrested all these Jewish people in the Crystal Night action. There were about 10,000 of us in camp, and we were not made to work, although there were enough barracks to house all of us, which shows that the things had been in preparation for quite some time. We, even though we didn't have to work, we had a roll call every day, but we were able to watch the prisoners that had been in the camp before. They were being marched off to work details and or driven off to work details, and we saw them come back at night, lined up in formations where they had to watch punishment being meted out. There, even though we were not involved in any of this, but we watched them hang people. We watched them beat people to a pulp. We watched them tie people's hands behind their backs and then hang them on what looked like meat hooks, and only take them down once they had fainted. And worst of all, I saw them stick a man into a barrel that was spiked with nails, was rolled down a hill. And at the foot of the hill as S-guards were there with dogs that finished off these poor people. I mean, those are atrocities that you cannot imagine. We watched them, we saw them, we're witness to it. Fortunately, in those days, the Germans permitted anyone who was able to leave Germany to get out yet. That was before the basic Holocaust killings started. They started when the Germans marched into Poland the 1st of September. After that, all bets were off, at least for people in Eastern Europe. But in Western Europe, they still let people out if they could prove that they would leave Germany before too long. In other words, the Wannsee Conference that basically dictated the final solution of the Jewish question hadn't taken place yet. I was lucky enough, my parents contacted a friend of mine who had come to this country and said, look, Ernest needs an affidavit, which means he needs a sponsor to be able to get out of concentration camps. Those were the conditions that the Germans had about letting people out of camp. Well, my friend talked to the people he was rooming with. He'd only come here a short time before that. And they said, we'll sponsor him. People who sponsored me, a total stranger to him, and basically they saved my life. And of course, I and my family have been grateful to them as long as they ever lived. Well, to make a long story short, I ended up coming to this country in May of 1939. After a number of jobs, all kinds of jobs, from being a helper on a truck and working in a garage and sorting dirty rags, I finally ended up with a job as a mechanic building truck bodies for a defense contractor, and I was able to get a draft permit. In those days, everybody age 18, I imagine still today, has to register for the draft. I had registered, and my boss got me an occupational deferment from the draft, considering that I was doing defense-related work. And I was lucky to do that and happy to do that, because as soon as I had left Germany, all Jews had their assets confiscated and blocked. And anybody who had left Germany after that time would have had to pay for any passage out of Germany with foreign currency. My parents were still permitted to pay for mine with our own funds. Anyhow, I came over here, did mechanical work for a number of years, and along came Pearl Harbor. Well, after that, there was no chance to help my parents anymore, and I went the day after Pearl Harbor to City Hall in Philadelphia, where I lived, tried to enlist. Physical exam, a lot of questions to answer, some papers to fill out, and one of the questions was citizenship status. Well, I had applied for, because I had gotten my green card. We all know about the green card. We talk about that today with a lot of the illegal immigrants and so on. I had gotten my green card right after my arrival in this country, and figured, okay, I want to get even with the Germans, but that comes first. Sorry, buddy, you can't enlist, was what I was told at City Hall after all, going through all these preparations. I said, well, what can I do to get into the service? Well, you can go to the draft board and tell them to cancel your deferment. I went to the draft board, told them to cancel my deferment, and 3 weeks later I was in uniform at Fort Meade in Maryland. Well, then basic training at Camp Wheeler outside of Macon in Georgia. After basic training was over and a bunch of IQ tests, I was told, go to post headquarters. They want you to apply to go to Officer Candidate School, OCS. I go to post headquarters. They open up my folder, look, see that I'm not a citizen. Sorry, buddy, you can't go to OCS. You're not a citizen. Well, I ended up being in a line outfit, doing coast patrol in Maine for a number of months, and then sometime in 1942, Congress passed a law that anyone who would serve honorably in the military for at least 6 months would not have to wait the customary 5 years that it usually takes for a legal immigrant to become a citizen. Well, my 6 months were up in September, and in October 42, I was naturalized in Boston. And 4 weeks later, I was at Fort Benning in Georgia in Officer Candidate School. 3 months later, I graduated as a second lieutenant infantry as a 90-day wonder, as they used to call us, the regular Army people. Of course, they looked down on the graduates of the candidate schools. But my military service began, and then I trained recruits for a while at Fort McClellan in Alabama, and had orders all of a sudden to go to the West Coast. I went and argued my point and said, look, I speak German, I have a working knowledge of French, and I can't see how I can be of use in the Pacific, but in Europe I might be able to do some good. Next thing I knew is I got my orders changed. I was at Camp Ritchie in Maryland, and which has an intelligence training school. There, a quick course in military intelligence. I don't want to go into detail. I became one of the Ritchie boys. There's a film in existence that talks about them, by the way. And I ended up going to Europe as second in command of an interrogation team for prisoners of war. In England, we practiced on some German prisoners that were in stockades over there that had been captured in North Africa. And of course, these guys knew exactly what they were telling us. They had no information to give us anymore that would have been of any use for us. But they knew how to handle us, and they always were glad that when they strung us along, that they ended up with a couple of cigarettes or something like that, which otherwise they wouldn't have had. Anyhow, the war broke out, and at the time, the commanding officer of the 113th Mechanized Cavalry, in those days we had a mechanized cavalry unit that basically didn't have horses anymore, but we had light tanks and armored cars and so on, and basically functions of that unit were either reconnoitering in front of infantry units or protecting flanks. I, with half of my team, was assigned to that unit and spent the entire wartime with them. And we were lucky enough to capture a number of prisoners during that time, and of course I was able to interrogate them, and we were able to use that information quite profitably. After the Siegfried Line had been breached, our units had captured the town of Aachen, which is on the border between Germany and Belgium and Holland, basically. And since I'd grown up in that area, I was a little familiar with it. I thought the Germans had built some dams on a river there in the early 1930s and hastened it, and I couldn't see why, because there were some other dams on that river. And anyhow, I thought that there might be some military significance to them. I went and found the water administration building in the town, and with a couple of men, we found a safe that we blew open, and in it we found documents that had a German army study that shows what would happen if those dams were blown, how many billions of gallons of water would cascade downriver, how large an area would be inundated, how long it would be impassable and whatnot. And it so happened that, it so happens that 12th Army Group had planned an attack to the Rhine River just about that time, and the minute they got those documents, the attack orders of probably pretty nearly 250,000 men were immediately put on hold. And I think that had we not found these documents and the Germans been able to blow those dams during our attack, we might have lost an awful lot of men and equipment at that time. Well, the war went on. I was just given a time limit. Another thing that happened, the town of Einfach, after quite some advance during the war, town of Einfach was having a headquarters of a large German unit, and people had come through the lines telling us, look, what can you do? We want to save the town, and we're done with the war, and the general wants to put up a fight. Well, like a stupid idiot, I went and put a white rag on my Jeep at the time with my driver, who had volunteered with me, drove into town, and were taken to the general and told the general, look, we're prepared to attack this town, and you're responsible for the loss of life and property in the town if you put up a fight, and I am supposed to report to my commanding officer as what your decision is. To make a long story short, I drove out of that town sitting in the back seat of a Mercedes staff car, in the front seat, shaking like a leaf next to the driver, with 2 generals sitting in the back seat, 30 officers marching behind us very slowly, and about 300 men walking into our lines. So those were some of the things that happened for me during the war. A week later, on the 12th of April, 1945, the day President Roosevelt died, I was wounded seriously, and that was the end of the war for me. I didn't end my military service then, but I convalesced for quite some time and went back in service once more. Spent 2 years in Germany at that time in charge of the document center of the European Command Intelligence Center, where we again interrogated a lot of Germans, this time about the Russians, with whom we basically parted friendship. And, well, after 2 years I came home. That was pretty much the end of my military career. And I think I better stop right there.
As you can tell, these gentlemen have all experienced so much that we've never seen, and it's difficult for them to condense their experiences into the mere 15 minutes that I've given them this morning. So hopefully you will learn a little bit more about them and what they saw as we get to the question and answer session. But I'd now like to ask Mr. Marone to speak to you. And as Mr. Kaufman said, he was in Buchenwald as a prisoner. Mr. Marone was there as a liberator. And so their experiences were very different, but I think it will be good that you'll now have the opportunity to see some photographs of the concentration camp where Mr. Kaufman actually had been. So, Mr. Marone, can you tell us a little bit about your experiences during the war?
Mr. Kaufman was kind enough to give me a copy of his discharge from Buchenwald. That's the camp we'll be talking about today. During World War II, I was stationed in England with the 1st Army, 518th MP Battalion. We were preparing for the invasion of Europe. The invasion began on June the 6th, 1944, where 1 million men that included Army, Navy, and Air Force. 65% were American, and the rest were made up of British and French. It was here in England that I would celebrate my 19th birthday. A lot happened in 1944. There was D-Day, 3 months in France, and then the Battle of the Bulge, Normandy. The battle lasted from December the 15th to January the 15th. We suffered 25,000 casualties. The Germans suffered 100,000. Clothing and food and supply were scarce, and the weather was freezing cold. We lost our commanding officer, a colonel. He was 27 years old, a West Pointer, a first lieutenant, and several enlisted men. During this time, I celebrated my 20th birthday. Our outfit entered Germany in March 1945. We advanced to the Rhine River. Once across the Rhine, I would soon learn the word concentration camp. There was a time prior to 1944, most Americans were not aware of such a place or word. Our leaders knew, but never told the American people. In July 1944, the Soviet Army liberated Lublin, Poland. There they found the Majdanek concentration camp where 700,000 people were murdered. The U.S. authorities were notified by pictures sent via radio photo from Moscow to the U.S. In January 1945, the Red Army liberated Ashwoods concentration camp in Poland. There were 1.5 million people were executed. 90% were Jewish. Again, the American leaders were reluctant to believe the Soviet reports. I have in my possession a copy of that radio photo given to me by a friend who was with the Army intelligence. Of all the horrific events that took place during World War II, none is more grotesque than the Holocaust. For those who do not believe the Holocaust never took happen, they should visit Bad Arolsen, Germany, where there is a building that contains 17.5 million names of Hitler's victims. We're talking about the entire population of Philadelphia, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston, Texas. These are the complete files of all Nazi prisoners. Who knows what these deceased could have contributed to the world. In 1937, the Nazis decided on the final solution. That is the extermination of the entire Jewish population and other people considered undesirable. Heinrich Himmler was the architect of this idea. They built 24 major concentration camps for transit, labor, annihilation. There were many subcamps. In 1937, the Nazi leaders decided to build a concentration camp on Edelsberg Hill, located above Weimar, Germany. Because of all the beech trees, they named it Buchenwald. The name was given by Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was second in command only to Adolf Hitler and the founder command of all Nazi concentration camps. He was the second most powerful man in Germany. He was captured by a British patrol in May 1945. He promptly committed suicide. He had taken a poison capsule in his mouth. He was buried in an unmarked grave. For centuries, Weimar had been the culture center of Germany. Composers Richard Strauss, Franz Liszt lived and performed here, as did writers Friedrich Schiller and Johann Goethe. The much-talented Goethe picnic and wrote while on Edelsberg Hill. He once wrote, "Here one feels great and free." Little did he know what will be built at this site years later. You must forgive me, I'm losing my voice here. The camp, they call these the golden years, we call them the rusty years. The camp was built by prisoners. The main road leading to the camp was constructed by prisoners chained to wagons, pulling stone from choir to camp. Guards forced them to sing while working. They called them singing horses. Because of all the deaths building this road, it was called Blood Road. Guards would tell the prisoner, "You came through the gates, you leave through the chimney." There was a sign on the main gate that read in French, "Jardin de sang." You get what you deserve. In English it meant everyone gets what he deserves. Well, you think about that. They didn't deserve what they got, but think about it yourself as you get older. Whatever you do, you'll find out later on you deserve whichever you did. And then, the Jews were subjected to extraordinary cruel treatment, working 15 hours a day at the infamous Birkenwald quarry and local armament factories. The first commandant of Buchenwald was SS officer Karl Otto Kosch and his wife Ilse. Famous for their murderous qualities, Ilse was a collector of lampshades, gloves, and bookmarkers made from prisoner skins. She especially wanted a tattoo number shown in each item. Officer Kosch was a thief, a gambler, and a drunk. He was arrested by the German High Command and convicted and executed. Ilse Kosch was arrested in 1945 by we Americans, sentenced to life in prison, where she later committed suicide. She was the only woman brought before the American Military Tribunal in Dachau. One barracks at Buchenwald had been a stable for horses, now housed 700 men. There were 3 or 4 prisoners to a bunk of 3 tiers high. Because of the overcrowding, some slept in tents. The prison was made up of Russians, Poles, Czechs, and Germans. The Nazis interred any gay or gypsy. The inmates died from beating, starvation, lethal injection, experiments, hangings, and shootings. The official goal at this camp was to kill all prisoners. No words can describe the horrors committed to these people whose only crime was their political or religious beliefs. There was a group called the Lucky 168. They were Allied airmen. They were American, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealanders. They were held in Buchenwald for several months, and they witnessed the atrocities committed by the Nazis. 3 of these men were killed by the Nazis. They were eventually transferred to a POW camp. On April the 10th, the Germans told all prisoners were being evacuated at once, and they were planning to destroy the entire camp. I would guess they heard the Americans were coming. The inmates had eaten for 6 days, except for grass, eating grass, and potato peelings. On April 11th, the resistance movement decided to act. Armed with rifles and grenades, they attacked the guards. Many Germans were killed. The remaining SS fled, and the resistance took charge of running the camp. At 6 p.m. that evening, the first American tank appeared at the gates of Buchenwald. This was 183rd Combat Engineers, an all-black outfit. We were ordered to go to this camp outside of Weimar. We assumed it was a prisoner of war camp. We entered Buchenwald on April the 12th, 1945. I had no inclination at what to expect. The smell was horrendous. My stomach was queasy. There were hundreds of bodies stacked up like lumber. It was an unbelievable sight. I shall never forget it. I had seen death before, but nothing like this. This was a murder factory. They were cremating 400 bodies a day. The Germans had killed 51,000 at this camp. We're talking about the population of Collingswood, Voorhees, and Audubon. Our unit was ordered to escort, guard, interrogate any German prisoners, and also advise 1st Army Headquarters of conditions. We desperately needed medical supplies, food supplies, and clothing. The inmates were glad to see us. They were in a dazed state, some too weak to get out of the bunks. Some of the dead had been shot, hung, tortured, or died from experiments. This was mass murder. We were ordered to round up all civilians within a 10 or 12 mile radius. One woman smiled, and our captain said, "Take her through again." We had the Germans bury the dead. Denial of the Holocaust has hardly been limited to the Buchenwald neighbors. The inmates built a monument of wood in memory of the 51,000 killed at this murder factory called Buchenwald. There is now a sculpture in honor of the resistant fighters. There is a heavy emphasis on the communist and social democratic political prisoners, with virtually no mention of the Jews or other victims. There were 21,000 survivors of Buchenwald, including 700 children. One teenager was Elie Wiesel. Mr. Wiesel survived concentration camps at Ashwoods, Borno, Gleiwig, and Buchenwald. His father died before we arrived at the camp. Upon leaving Buchenwald, he was shipped to Paris. Mr. Wiesel spent a few years at a French orphanage. In 1948, began to study in Paris at the Sorbonne, and later became a journalist for a French newspaper. He authored 36 works dealing with Judaism and the Holocaust. In 1985, he received a Congressional Gold Medal. In 1936, the Nobel Peace Prize. He received the Gold Medal. One book he wrote was titled The Night. Chronicling his time at 4 concentration camps. He is my hero not only for what he's endured and what he's become. For the past 13 years, I've been speaking to schools, civic groups, and any organization that wants to hear my story. I would always mention, I'd like to meet Mr. Wiesel someday. Wine University learned of this, inviting me to hear him speak at the Kimmel Center. He and I met after his talk. It was one of the greatest moments of my life. I told him I waited 61 years to meet him. Germany surrendered on May the 8th. We then prepared to go to the Pacific, as the war was still on in the Pacific. The atomic bomb was dropped on Japan, and they surrendered on August the 15th, 1945. I celebrated my 21st birthday in Germany. I was awarded a Silver Star. After 8 months in Germany, this guy finally returned to the good old USA. I was discharged on Christmas Eve, safe and sound, with all my body parts. For anyone who would like to believe that one of the greatest crimes of all times never happened, I answer this with 3 simple words. I was there. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to very quickly show you some of the pictures of Buchenwald that Mr. Marone brought with him, and then we're going to go to Q&A from the schools, I think. Yeah. So I think we're going to just go through them because it's difficult for Mr. Marone to see them, and I think you can see them. They all have explanations with them.
That's the entrance. There's the gate with the famous saying, Shadam Dasang. There he is.
Heinrich Himmler.
Yes. That's Otto Kosch. He signed
my
discharge paper, yeah. They're registered and go to the camp, and believe it or not, they had computers. They had a type of a computer. The Germans kept perfect records. How do you know they had some? They kept the records of everything. Next picture.
Those computers, you should know, were provided by IBM.
There it is, right there. That's the camp. Weisel's on the top shelf there. I put an arrow to it. These are the Allied airmen. Is there any bags where he slept?
Yeah. Yep. Mr. Marone, I don't know if you just heard him, said, remember, these are the barracks that Mr. Kaufman actually slept in.
Yeah. That's where they hung them. And in the far corner, you'll see a group there. What they're doing is they're kicking, the prisoners are kicking a dead German officer. They're kicking him out of frustration. There's the band they had to drown out the complaints, I guess.
That was Mr. Marone when he finally met Elie Wiesel. And that's it. So we'd like to give you the opportunity to ask some questions, and any or all of our panelists would be happy to answer your questions. So Centerville, we're going to start with you.
Mr. Maroon, what was it? When you learned you were going into a camp, what was going through your head at that time?
Okay.
Well, as I said, I didn't know it was going to be a concentration camp. We thought it was going to be American prisoners or a political prison, not a concentration. We never heard of a concentration camp. We didn't know. Then we started getting the smell as we approached it, and then I'll never forget it. Never forget it.
Egg Harbor Township, do you have a question for any of our speakers?
Yes, we do.
I'm sure.
I have a question for both of the Liberators. Did you have any idea what to expect when you were going in to liberate the camps, and do you think you were prepared?
Okay, I'm sorry. The question was, did they have any idea what to expect when they were going into the camps? And did they feel prepared for what they saw? Am I correct? Okay. So I think pretty much Mr. Marone just answered that and said that he really did not know that he was entering a concentration camp. So, Mr. Seltzer?
As stated before, we were not aware of any concentration camps. The only camps we were aware of were prisoner of war camps. So again, when we first saw in the distance this camp, we thought it was a prisoner of war camp until we got closer. And that was our first inkling of concentration camps. Naturally, Eisenhower and some of the higher up officers, they were aware, but we were not. So again, it was something that was the biggest surprise of our life when we saw this.
Thank you. Penwood Middle School would like to give you a turn to ask a question.
Have you kept in touch with anyone you liberated?
Have they kept in touch with anyone that they liberated?
The only person I ever had was Mr. Wiesel.
Right. And
I was very fortunate. I have been able to locate close to 5 people that I liberated, and the last one I located was a gentleman down in Florida, and I have been spoken to him quite a few times. And when I went back to retrace my steps with my wife, and I went to the camp, I took a picture of the barracks that he was in, which I carry with me now. I'm sorry I can't show it to you, but he was in barracks 4, and naturally when the barracks were removed, they now have a brick there with the number of the camp, the barracks number on there, and I took that picture and send it back to the gentleman in Florida.
Thank you. Londonderry, it's your turn for a question.
Yes, I have a question. This is for any of the veterans to answer. Do you hold anything against some of the people in our country who knew about the concentration camps but chose not to say anything to any of the soldiers?
Okay, so the question is, do you hold anything against the American government and politicians who knew what was going on and didn't do anything about it? Ernest, why don't you start us off?
Well, this country saved my life, so there's very little that I can say that would criticize what went on in those days. And of course, I also wasn't familiar with what was going on at the time. There's been a lot of talk that Roosevelt could have done more had he tried to save some of the people. And the question was, why didn't they bomb some of the railroad tracks and stations that led to some of these extermination camps? And it wasn't done, and supposedly it wasn't done because the war effort took precedence.
Okay. Mr. Marone, how do you feel about how the American government kept secret from the soldiers what was happening?
They should have kept that secret. We should have known what was going on over there and what was happening to those people. We should have taken action sooner. We shouldn't have waited like we're doing today. We shouldn't have waited. We should have taken our action.
Mr. Seltzer, how do you see it?
Well, it's pretty hard, but again, I definitely feel that we should have been aware of these concentration camps and not come upon them like we did.
Thank you. Sterling High School, does anyone have a question for us? Go ahead.
My name's Ben Mallett, and I was wondering for Mr. Kaufman, were you able to ever find out what happened to your family that was left in Germany?
Okay,
Yes.
so I'm going to repeat the question in case the other schools didn't hear him. He asked Mr. Kaufman if he was ever able to find out what happened to his family in Germany.
Yes, I know, and there are records that show that my parents were deported from my hometown into a place in Poland, and eventually they were murdered in a death camp called Belzec, B-L-Z-E-Z, in which more than 500,000 people were killed within a 9 months period.
Thank you. Centerville Middle School, we're back to you.
This question is for Mr. Schultzer.
You got to speak louder than that.
This question is for Mr. Schultzer. How long did it take you to liberate the concentration camp?
Okay, how long did it take you to liberate the concentration camp?
Well, when we came to the camp the first day, we walked in, and actually the prisoners were not aware that they were liberated. And in my half-track, I carried American flags, and we had some of our soldiers with me grab these flags and take them out and give them to the people who were there, and I think that's when they finally realized that they were liberated. So I can't put any actual time on it because it happened so fast and quickly that it was just one of those things.
So there was no resistance from German soldiers at that point?
Well, there was no resistance because, again, as we were coming up on the camp, we could see, I guess all prisoner of war camps were, concentration camps were run by the SS troops. And we saw them running across the field carrying white papers, and actually it must have been information about the prisoners. And when we got to the camp, there was only 6 SS troopers left with 2 police dogs there. So again, the amount of time, it just happened so quickly that it seemed like a couple minutes as far as I was concerned, but I'm sure it was more than a couple minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Marone, was your experience the same? The guards left and your unit just pretty much walked in?
Yeah, the prisoners, they uprose against the Germans. You wonder why these other camps wouldn't have done the same thing.
Egg Harbor Township, would you like another question?
Please.
Mr. Kaufman, how long were you in the concentration camp?
Just a few days short of 30 days, which was 2 months too long.
Thank you. Penwood Middle School, we're going to go to you now.
Good morning. I have a question for the 2 liberators. Did you ever get a chance to talk to the survivors? And if so, what were the most memorable words or phrases?
Were you able to speak to the people in the concentration camps that you were liberating? And was there anything that you remember them telling you at that point?
Well, the ones that I was able to locate after the war was...
No, she means at the time of liberation, they're asking.
Well, at the time of liberation, again, it was pretty hard for communications with them. Naturally, I was able to talk to a few of them because I was able to speak a little German. And again, they definitely could not believe that they finally were going to be free. And again, it was just an unbelievable situation. And it's pretty hard to explain unless you were really there. And again, as I said, I was 19 when I landed on D-Day, and I was 20 years old when we liberated the camp. And it was something that we were glad to do, but I can't say any more than that.
Okay, I'm going to ask you gentlemen to tell us how old you are today.
Well, I am at a young age of 89.
89.
2 weeks short of 93.
Okay, so you understand how fortunate you are to be able to hear these gentlemen today. Londonderry, we're going to give you the last question.
We'd like to start off by thanking all of you for your service in the war. It's green. Anyways, our question is regarding Mr. Kaufman's return to Germany and his motivation for doing so, and whether or not he was afraid after